Well, hello everybody, and thanks for joining on this Saturday. I think it's morning for most of you who are probably watching today. This is a pop-up session. Was not planning on doing one today. You might have surmised by the relatively late notice for this one. But given some unfolding events around the country, I think it's important to have this conversation now before some of the things that are going to happen this week actually take place. There is also the practical reality that I'm going to be traveling over the next several days, so I'll be limited in my ability to have those live sessions as some of these events unfold. I'll probably still be available on various social media platforms during that period, but it'll be a little bit harder for me to do these live streams. So I wanted to have this conversation now. There's a lot going on right now. As I've talked about, there is the still unfolding aftermath of the catastrophic regional flood event in the Southern Appalachians from Hurricane Helene and its predecessor rain event. The death toll there is now approaching 250, and there are still hundreds missing. So that remains an unfolding tragedy where search and rescue operations there are still active and ongoing. So there are still some more remote valleys and hilltops that have yet to be reached. So that remains an ongoing effort, and that ends up being important in talking about what's coming down the pike later this week and beyond, because most of the skilled search and rescue teams and swiftwater rescue teams from around the country were sent to the disaster zone in the southeastern U.S. in response to this as part of a mutual aid response. That is normal and expected for a major disaster. One of the benefits of having those teams, which are often based in major cities around the country, is that usually you don't have simultaneous disasters in multiple places, and so if each city maintains or each region maintains its own team, the national capacity to respond is actually larger than what any one region can do, because usually you can send those teams in from elsewhere. It just takes a day or two to get that going and set it up. The challenge now is that there may be multiple simultaneous or in short succession disasters unfolding, because after Helene we now have what appears to be an increasingly ominous picture in the Gulf of Mexico once again, with another major hurricane taking aim at the west coast of Florida in just a few days, probably making landfall around Wednesday. And this one might hit a much more populated section of coast, including some overlap with areas that saw major storm surge during Helene, but potentially taking a much more direct aim at large population centers that are both highly storm surge and inland freshwater flood vulnerable. That may include the Tampa Bay area pretty directly. So I'll get into that in a moment. But the problem is, a lot of these search and rescue and water rescue teams are already deployed. They can, of course, redeploy if that ends up being the need, but that starts to become difficult because it means that the regions that they're from don't have coverage or as much coverage for a much longer period of time. And of course, there are a limited number of people on these teams. This takes very specialized expertise, and so at a certain point of active deployment, the human capacity to continue to engage at that high level is going to be tough if there are multiple concurrent or consecutive engagements. The other issue is that right now there are concerns over a funding shortfall for FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and that is the subject of any number of misinformation campaigns going on right now as to why that is. The reality is not that those funds from FEMA were reallocated to some inappropriate or unrelated need in the country. Instead, the reality is that just the actual disaster-related expenditures have been so extremely high, especially with Helene and the ongoing need for expenditure to respond to Helene and its catastrophic flood aftermath, as well as other events that have unfolded this year. That's far from the only disaster in the U.S. so far this year, that the existing funding that's been allocated to FEMA is not enough to continue offering response, especially long-term disaster response, at the level that would be expected and has been the case historically, unless there is essentially direct intervention by Congress. And right now, there is no such intervention scheduled. So that could change, but Congress is in recess. FEMA, for long-term response, and all of these major disasters require long-term response, is likely to not have adequate funds as soon as this week, following Helene and with this next major event coming up. So that is a major issue. There are still other paths for some of the very short-term emergency response to still occur even with that immediate funding crisis, but it makes everything a lot more difficult, and it does mean that unless things change, folks who are affected by the upcoming disasters, as well as some folks who need long-term assistance with Helene, won't be able to access it unless things change in the short term. But there is yet another issue, and this brings us a little bit closer to the western U.S., which is that right now, most of the western U.S. is enduring yet another record-breaking heat wave. And in some ways, the one the West is experiencing right now is even more astonishing than ones that came earlier this year, in the sense that it is October, and it is pretty hard to achieve some of the temperatures we're seeing day after day after day. In some places right now, many locations in the western United States have exceeded their all-time record high temperatures for the month of October, and in many cases have done so on multiple consecutive days, setting a new record on the 1st or 2nd of October, then breaking that record on the 3rd or 4th, and then perhaps even again a third time. And this heat has extended all the way to the coast, so even places like San Francisco and the west side of LA are very hot, which is not, it's not that unusual for these places to be relatively warm this time of year, late into the autumn, but it is very unusual for so many places inland as well as the coast to simultaneously be seeing extreme to record-breaking heat even at this time of year. The reason why that's a problem from a disaster response perspective is not so much that the heat wave itself is a disaster that FEMA is responding to or other agencies, but in that what it means for wildfire activity in the West is that the wildfire activity in many western states is far above average levels for October. In fact, in some states where wildfire activity usually is virtually absent by this late in the season, there is a very high level of fire activity. Idaho in particular has numerous very large and immediately threatening fires, but also so too do states like Oregon, Montana, Nevada, Wyoming, Colorado, Arizona. And interestingly, in California, there is a somewhat more limited amount of fire activity, but it is still now increasing as this long duration and record-breaking heat wave goes on. There was a significant fire up in Lake County yesterday, and there still have been struggles with the ongoing containment of the line fire in Southern California. Other fires have popped up, but none have become particularly significant yet. But there are red flag warnings for record heat and strong winds across a large portion of the interior West today, all the way from the Snake River Plain in Idaho all the way east to the Front Range of Colorado and Wyoming. So there may well yet be additional large new fires requiring large-scale response in the coming days, as this heat is expected to continue more or less indefinitely, at least for the next couple of weeks. And I will look into that, and I'll show you some images related to that as well. But the reason why that, again, matters from a national response perspective is twofold. One is it keeps wildland firefighting resources occupied in the West at a time of year when even in a typical season they would be becoming less available, because federal wildland firefighters are, for the most part, especially Forest Service, seasonal workers. They don't have a year-round contract because the historical view is that fire season was not year-round in the West. And so many of those crews are being let go, either last week or this week. So there are far fewer fire crews available right now than there were a few weeks ago, and there will be even fewer later in October, as fire season in the West looks set to continue for that period. And that means that not only are the Forest Service crews for federal lands becoming less available to manage fires in those settings, but also federal forest crews are sometimes deployed on a contingent and temporary basis to other kinds of disasters elsewhere in the country. So the National Interagency Coordination Centers will sometimes deploy firefighting resources to disasters that aren't necessarily fire-related, because some of the same skills there is overlap in the sense of having vehicles with equipment that can help clear roads, chainsaws for downed trees, and commencing search and rescue operations, things like that. So the fewer crews available for fires, the fewer crews also available then to redeploy nationally to these other concurrent disasters, especially the hurricane and flood related ones that are already unfolding and look likely to have yet a new event, at least one additional major event just this week coming up in the Southeast and in Florida in particular. So that is a challenge then both for fires in the West, for hurricanes and floods in the Southeast, and then also for whatever else might pop up that we don't know about yet. That's just stuff that we know has already happened or is likely to happen imminently. There are other sorts of things that can arise, and I won't even say it out loud for fear of jinxing it, but suffice it to say that this is a pretty big problem, and there are lots of folks arguing about the details around the FEMA funding thing, and there's some pretty toxic and incorrect conspiracy theories running around as to why FEMA funding is depleted to the state that it is now. And it is also true that it's not the case that FEMA has no capacity to respond at all, because there are other emergency funding sources for very short-term acute responses only. But it is true that for any sort of ongoing or long-term response, which frankly is one of the primary roles of an agency like FEMA, that they don't have that funding available unless something changes very soon. And that's already a problem in the aftermath of Helene, and is going to be a much bigger problem with what's likely to become Hurricane Milton, already Tropical Storm Milton, that will potentially be a major disaster on the Gulf Coast of Florida in a much more populated setting than Helene was on the Big Bend of Florida just last week. So maybe it makes sense to show some imagery. First, I just want to, just as a brief summary, again, it was just a little over a week ago, so about 8 days or so, that Helene, 8 or 9 days ago that Helene made landfall, and about 8 days ago that it brought peak flooding to the Southern Appalachians. Most of western North Carolina is still largely cut off from the outside world. There are some roads that are starting to be open to emergency traffic only. There is some cell phone coverage coming back, but there's still a lot of places where there's no roads, no running water, no electricity, and where people are still trapped. There are valley by valley, even property by property search and rescue operations going on, mainly via helicopter. Folks are hiking in. There are mule packs going in up these valleys. And again, I shared some footage on YouTube yesterday as for some people who have managed to get some pretty incredible footage out on the ground of the aftermath. And they're literally just hiking through valleys, river valleys, even just valleys that had a, less than a river, just a creek in them ordinarily, that have pretty much been transformed geologically. You can see how these features were shaped, carved through the landscape. But this isn't a case of roads that were flooded or locally washed out. This is a case where whole highways just don't exist anymore, nor the embankments or the engineered infrastructure that sustain them. So this is not a case even where temporary roads can be built. In some cases, there are just gigantic boulder fields the size of large vehicles sitting where state highways used to be. So that is the situation. They're having to completely rebuild the water infrastructure, and in some cases the electrical and telecommunications infrastructure, in a moment where in many cases the roads also no longer exist. So that is the scale of the disaster there. And so obviously there's an ongoing response that will, the estimate is that the full recovery from this will likely take years to decades, even depending on what we mean by full recovery. But the short-term recovery, even just getting basic services like water and electricity restored, could take months in some places. So that's, and then that's also, meanwhile in Florida, although Helene did not hit a particularly highly populated area, which was fortunate because it brought a record-breaking storm surge of greater than 15 feet along the Big Bend coast. There were some small communities severely affected, but generally no major cities in the Big Bend coast of Florida with that Category 4 landfall, so that was fortunate. But there was still a large and even record-breaking storm surge in places like the Tampa Bay area. It was close to 10 feet, which again, that's taller than any human on Earth by a considerable margin. So the storm surge in Tampa was still deep enough that any human on Earth standing there would have been completely underwater. So that's not nothing by any means. In fact, it was a record storm surge. Still, even though the storm hit well to the north, Helene was a particularly large storm, so it was able to generate a significant storm surge even well away from its center. There were some successful interventions. There's images of a hospital, for example, near the water in Tampa that successfully deployed a storm surge barrier, which did keep the hospital from flooding despite nearly 10 feet of water outside the barrier, which is kind of remarkable. But the problem is now there has been transport of several feet of sand. It almost looks like snow that has completely buried city streets and some surge protection infrastructure. There is not going to be time to fix that infrastructure and clear the region of debris before the next major storm comes close. And this one, right now, unfortunately, it's pretty eye-popping to see the statistics. It may well end up making a beeline pretty close to the Tampa Bay area, which is a pretty worst-case scenario. Again, this is a storm that may once again undergo rapid intensification and could be a major Category 3 or higher storm at landfall. And again, this landfall is likely to be closer to the Tampa Bay area and could even potentially be a more or less direct hit, which would be a bit of a nightmare. As I mentioned, had Helene hit Tampa Bay, had Tampa Bay area in Florida been in the right front quadrant, the strongest part of the storm with the largest onshore storm surge component, it would have been a disaster of even greater proportions. It would have really been a nightmare. And unfortunately, that's a scenario now that potentially is at play just a little over a week later with the next hurricane, Milton, which appears to be rapidly developing. It's not a hurricane yet, but it likely will be so soon, perhaps even by later today, depending on the rate of intensification. So I'm going to share my screen a bit and start showing some things I think are relevant to this conversation. So bear with me for a moment. Okay, so I think this is going to refresh. This is again Levi Cohen's pretty awesome Tropical Tidbits webpage. They're still calling it Tropical Depression 14, but the Hurricane Center just upgraded it, so I think this just hasn't gone through the update cycle. Here's what it looks like. Obviously, it's not yet a hurricane, so it doesn't look extremely impressive on satellite, but it's going to get there sooner rather than later. So what I really wanted to show is here's the National Hurricane Center uncertainty cone. Let me just make sure it's showing. Okay, good. It's showing what it looks like it should. Obviously, a few days out, the cone of uncertainty is wide. In fact, this currently still, for a landfall late on Wednesday, still encompasses almost the entire west coast of Florida, technically even the Big Bend coast where Helene made landfall. However, although folks should not focus too much on the center of the cone, I'll show you what the hurricane track models are showing, and right now they are, in this case, which is not always true, clustered pretty close to the center of the cone. But this just goes to show you that we're still a way out, there's still a range of outcomes, but it's more likely than not that this hurricane hits a much more populated part of Florida than Helene did just last week. And so here is the most recent cycle of I'm going to blow this up a little bit. These are some different hurricane models, and you can kind of see what I mean. Even though the cone of uncertainty encompasses the Big Bend coast of Florida, there currently are no models that actually explicitly show the storm going that far north. In fact, right now, most of them are fairly tightly clustered right around Tampa Bay. That's right here, and that's not good. There are a couple of outliers, although I think these are more statistical models, so these may be less relevant. This would be a better outcome, although it's still more populated in the Big Bend coast, but at least this would mean the worst storm surge would essentially hit the Everglades, where essentially a gigantic national park. That would be a better outcome, but unfortunately right now, that's not where most of the models are showing this going. Instead, they're showing this making a beeline for Tampa Bay area, which could bring an enormous storm surge to a very storm surge vulnerable and highly populated section of the west coast of Florida. That would be very bad. Also, this storm is likely to produce very heavy inland rainfall, and this could be another major inland freshwater flood event across central Florida as well. But so really this could be, again, a 1-2 punch with a predecessor rain event over Florida preceding the storm, just like we saw up in western North Carolina, and then an intensifying major hurricane making landfall in exactly the same area shortly thereafter. Here's another way of looking at it. Here's just the American GFS model. And as you can see, there's a couple of random elements that have some crazy outliers, but for the most part, these are clustered pretty closely on the central Gulf Coast of Florida, which again is very close to Tampa, or Sarasota, or any number of significant storm surge vulnerable West Coast Florida cities and populated areas. So this is a pretty concerning scenario, and you really shouldn't focus on the intensity here. The global models aren't going to get intensity right for a hurricane, but if you want to look at that, here is essentially what the hurricane intensity models are showing for this soon-to-be hurricane, and they are fairly alarming. The official forecast has the hurricane making landfall on the west coast of Florida as a borderline Category 2, Category 3 storm, which is a bit of a conservative prediction, unfortunately, given the current most skilled hurricane intensification models, which actually have this up in Category 3 or even Category 4 territory. So once again, and the Hurricane Center has specifically said that they think this intensity prediction is a bit conservative and could be revised upward, which would mean at this point a major Category 3 or higher hurricane at landfall. That is, again, really not what you want to see on the west coast of Florida at any year, or really, but especially not now, and especially not on that particular segment of coast where the track forecasts are currently clustered. So that could change, this could change, but here's the problem. When you look at when you look at the position of this storm, we know it's not going to move north. So this is not going to be a Texas, Louisiana storm. We know it's not going to move to the south meaningfully. So this is not going to be a Mexico or Yucatan Peninsula storm. This is almost certainly going to be a Florida storm. This is a storm that's going to move to the northeast, and to the northeast, almost inevitably, is Florida. There would have been a narrow window of opportunity to sneak out the Florida Strait south of the Florida Keys, but it just does not look likely that that's going to happen. Given this is not a storm where there's high uncertainty in track, because there are some decent steering winds, as I mentioned. The storm isn't going to meander. It's very likely going to hit Florida, and it's probably going to hit somewhere along the central coast of the western Gulf Coast of Florida. So there's not really anywhere for this one to go but Florida, and so it's a question of exactly where and how intense it's going to be. It is worth noting that the worst case scenarios for a place like Tampa Bay would actually be if the storm made landfall either directly in the bay, which certainly is possible given these track forecasts, or just north of the bay, which is also possible. The reason for that is the right front quadrant, so essentially the right half, so the just right of the center line is where the largest onshore flow would be. So the winds blowing from ocean to land, that means that's where you can drive the very worst storm surge. So if the track of this hurricane is either directly over or just north of Tampa, that would be kind of a nightmarish scenario for that region, and that very much is in play. Although other tracks farther to the south, which would still be potentially a big deal for Tampa and more devastating for Sarasota or Point South, are also possible, because we are still 4 days out or so. So again, this is something I normally wouldn't focus on. I don't normally focus on tropical weather as much, but one reason why I'm doing so right now is because there is this big national big picture with converging disaster crisis, disaster fatigue. Another piece here is that if this really does come ashore as a major hurricane and hits one of the major west coast cities of Florida, this really would threaten to collapse a precarious home insurance market in this part of the world. The homeowners insurance market in Florida is already on the verge of collapse, and this could plausibly be I almost use the expression the straw that broke the camel's back, but really this isn't so much of a straw as a heavy weight on top of an already precarious situation. So, this is a developing situation, and we'll just have to see how it goes. But the other thing I wanted to illustrate. And here's a satellite image of the western United States. One thing to note is that there is no meaningful clouds or precipitation really anywhere. There's just isolated. There's some stratus in the Willamette Valley. There's some random mountain stratocumulus over western Montana, but I mean everywhere else it is pretty much just severe clear. A few cumulus popping up over the Sierra, and then this little patch of altocumulus off the coast of California. Believe it or not, that's even produced a couple of isolated dry lightning strikes over the past couple of days. Keep an eye on it. Don't think it'll be a big deal, but every once in a while you get some surprises. But the point is, for October, this is a really dry looking picture. Usually there's a storm somewhere by this time of the year in the west, and there just is nothing right now. But what you do see is smoke, and it's a little bit hard to see on this map. But if I bring up the infrared, it's going to be a little bit easier to see. And in fact, if this was a little bit later in the afternoon, it would probably be even more apparent as the fires picked up in intensity a bit. But just to illustrate, circling some major fires that I can see right now already burning at this time of day. Here's the cluster of fires in central Idaho. So these are all producing significant flame and smoke already in the morning, and there's a red flag warning. Obviously I'm broad brushing it a bit, essentially for this region, so a big area today. And so beyond that, we can take a look at the even bigger picture, perhaps. Let's see if we can... Yes, here's the really big picture that includes... You can see the fires up here. You can see the developing hurricane here. So, we got the fires in the west. We got the hurricane here that's generally going to go in this direction. The disaster region that's still... Let me redraw that a little bit better. The Helene disaster region is essentially in this kind of swath. This is the region that experienced a combination of damaging or even destructive winds and catastrophic flooding. The worst of it is arguably up in this region here, Southern Appalachians. And as you can see, if this storm sort of takes this sort of trajectory toward the Tampa region, generally speaking, there will be potentially some overlap with the previous disaster, but mostly this is going to be a new region of concern. So that's the big challenge with all of this, is concurrent overlapping disasters intersecting with, quite frankly, electoral politics. This is an election year, and there are, in Congress, that does sometimes at least partially dictate outcomes. So let me bring one more thing onto the screen here. Okay, so here is, and I'm actually going to need to zoom out a little bit so I can click through. Obviously, it's been super hot in the west, and this is a record-breaking heat wave across inland areas. Again, when I say record-breaking, it doesn't mean that it's, in all cases, the single hottest temperature ever observed in a location. It is all relative. If you saw 100 degrees in the middle of winter, that would be far more astonishing in a place like, say, Sacramento than it would be in July. But as we get into October, 100 degrees, even in Sacramento, is extremely unusual. Despite the folks who say, oh, it's always 100 degrees in October in the Central Valley, it is not. It has happened before, but never for these many consecutive days, and in many cases, it hasn't just been 100, but it's been more like 105 to 108, and that has indeed broken all-time October monthly temperature records in the Central Valley, in parts of the southeastern portions of California, but especially across Arizona, Nevada, and Utah. All places that have set new all-time monthly October record high temperatures this week. And the problem is, this isn't just one super hot day. it's just been going on and on and on. And places like Phoenix are likely to experience record-breaking temperatures for an astonishing 2 weeks consecutively, every single day for 2 weeks, record high temperatures or longer. That is getting close to being one of the longest stretches of unbroken record heat that I can think of anywhere in the western U.S. at any time of year. And looking forward to the next couple of weeks, I'm not sure that's going to change all that much. There will be some relief next week in California, although this weekend remains hot or even record hot in some places. But that relief will be relative. If you watch as we go into mid-October, it is cooler in places like the Bay Area and coastal LA. But look at the amount of red, pink, and pink on this map. It doesn't really go away. It fades a little bit, but by this point, we're looking out towards October 20th, a couple of weeks from now, and there's still red almost everywhere on this map, except for some locations along the immediate coast. That would mean, although the peak of the heat in many places is now, the cool down will be relative. It will be a cool down from all-time record high October temperatures to warmer or much warmer than average, but not record-breaking October temperatures, perhaps. Although in places like Las Vegas and Salt Lake City and Phoenix, this may still be record-breaking, of course, because as you go later in the month, the average temperatures go down pretty considerably in October, and yet this year that might not actually be what happens. From a precipitation perspective, again, next 10 days, really, there will be good rain in western Washington, which is quite ordinary for this time of year, and probably some along the immediate coast of Oregon, too. But outside of the chance of a few showers along the north coast, there's really nothing to speak of for California. And there could be a few showers over the high Rockies, central and southern Rockies, but really not a whole lot. And we go out all the way to the end of the ensemble run. And again, we do see that there's a chance of some rain along California's far north coast, which is, again, still below average, by the way, for this time of year all up there when the rainy season usually begins sooner than elsewhere in the state. But this is a very dry map for California and for most of the West for the next 2+ weeks still. Hot and dry continuing with virtually zero chance of rain in central and southern California, and really only a slight chance for most of northern California over the next 2 weeks, except for the north coast where the odds are decidedly better. And if we look at the precipitation anomalies, just to illustrate this, anywhere that's green has above average precipitation on a 1 week moving average basis. Anywhere that's yellow is below average precipitation on that basis. As you can see, there really isn't anywhere in the western U.S. that's going to see above average precipitation, and a lot of places are well below. Again, in central and southern California, the only reason why it's why it's white and not yellow, is that the average precipitation is so low, it's close to zero. That's not necessarily the case in Northern California, so you do see the drier than average showing up because there is some average to not experience, but that's not the case in this part of the world. And it is worth noting also that if I look at the full picture, obviously you can see this hurricane down in Florida, but just to illustrate the kind of total precipitation, perhaps this isn't the best tool to illustrate it. But anyway, one of the only places in the U.S. that might see significant precipitation in the next 2 weeks, and again, this is a very broad region of near zero precipitation for an ensemble average for the 2 weeks for 16 days in October. This is a very dry looking map, almost everywhere except for far northwestern Washington, and then of course the Florida peninsula with the hurricane activity there. Otherwise, this is a really dry map. And also, if you look at the national picture, pretty much the whole country is going to be well above average during this period. Less so in the east, but still not a lot of blue on this map. And what does this look like in terms of the large-scale pressure pattern? Well, if I zoom out to North America, again, we see that, again, a whole lot of red, not a lot of blue. But if we look at the normalized 500 millibar geopotential height pattern, we see this anomalous ridge weaken a bit across the west before re-strengthening potentially once again later in October, and quite frankly, just sort of sitting there over the west and central U.S. A lot of anomalous ridging on this map, and not a lot of anomalous troughing by any means. So I think that's really going to be a major challenge. Okay, so let me, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you will see me again. All right, I think it's time to take some questions. Again, thanks for joining on the pop-up session. I'm always a little bit impressed that this many people show up on short notice, particularly on the weekend. And again, generally my focus is still on California and the West, but when there are events of national significance or events that have implications indirectly for California, as I believe this week's sequence of events likely does, I think it's definitely worth the conversation. All right, lots of hellos with folks reporting that it's really warm. I know 79 degrees in Half Moon Bay in the morning doesn't sound that warm, but Half Moon Bay is a place that is notoriously very difficult to see high temperatures, so a morning temperature in the upper 70s is actually quite notable. Granted, October and September probably are the months you'd expect to see it there, as that marine layer becomes less prominent. Nonetheless, it's just representative of how warm the overall air mass truly is. Yes, there's a good point in the comments here. So one thing I did not mention, and this is actually quite important, is that when it comes to Milton's, the developing hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, its potential path towards Florida, the Gulf of Mexico remains record warm for this time of year. Again, the singularly warmest temperatures ever observed in the Gulf of Mexico at this time of year. That is very concerning because that is directly related to the potential for rapid intensification into a major hurricane of Milton, and that is exactly what is expected to happen, much as it did with Helene. Now, the problem is that for the most part, Milton will be drawing energy from a different part of the Gulf of Mexico than Helene did, so there's not a lot of overlap in their paths except for briefly. And so whatever energy Helene extracted from the Gulf of Mexico is not going to really interfere with Milton. In fact, even in Helene's path, ocean temperatures in the Gulf are still at or near record high temperatures even after the storm extracted a bunch of energy from it. So that is genuinely concerning, and it really does point to the high ceiling on any storms that developed. I even mentioned about 7 to 10 days ago, before Helene made landfall during one of these live streams, that this might not even be the last major hurricane landfall in the Gulf this season, and unfortunately that now appears likely to come to pass. I almost hesitate to say it, but even Milton may not be the last one this season. Although hopefully we can avoid a 1-2-3 punch. But again, disaster management, policy, and planning, you can't really you adopt a policy of keep your fingers crossed, even though I should say we shouldn't be. It's unsustainable and it's risky. In practice, that is in fact, to a certain extent, what we have to do in a resource and funding limited environment sometimes. But that is very important context. The ocean is record warm. That can fuel rapid intensification of storms, and in this case, this storm has virtually nowhere to go but Florida. So that is one reason why it's a particularly ominous picture. One is there's not really going to be an opportunity for this storm to miss land, as is sometimes the hope for recurving Atlantic hurricanes. And in this case, there is an abundant amount of hurricane fuel, record amounts of it even, in the hurricane's path as it makes a beeline for a particularly hurricane vulnerable portion of the state that has already been affected recently by another hurricane. So I think it's an interesting conundrum because in a lot of ways, and we're experiencing this here, along the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains, where there's just been weirdly, persistently balmy weather, and honestly, it's been in many ways quite pleasant It's in the 80s and even low 90s now into October. It's even been warm at night. I don't even think there have been any frosts locally yet. And again, a mile up, that's pretty bizarre for heading toward mid-October with not even a light frost yet, with daytime temperatures that are still well into shorts and a t-shirt territory. It's of course also deeply unnerving. So there is this dissonance in a lot of ways between what are arguably in the moment quite comfortable temperatures, quite pleasant weather locally, but is also a real indicator of something that is really deeply amiss with what's going on more broadly with the climate. And I think folks in California right now may be experiencing the same thing. I mean, these have been some incredible beach days, for sure. But also, as a result, there was just a fuels advisory issued by the Geographic Area Coordination Centers in California for wildfire risk this month. Vegetation flammability has now once again reached record levels. And I know it sounds bizarre for me to say record levels, record levels, record levels, but we just keep beating the previous records. And so all of that very nice weather at the coast, those 80, 90, even 95 degree days with really dry air, it's nice to be outside, especially if you're near the water, but the problem is what that's doing is drying vegetation out to peak summer dryness levels as we get into windy and no fog season. And so if we do get a big wind event in the next few weeks, or even in the next couple of months before the major rains arrive, that is going to result in extreme fire risk in California. So fire risk is high right now in California. There could be major fires, there have been, but not extreme. There's locally breezy conditions. There have been wind-driven fires like yesterday in Lake County, but it was not a catastrophe because there were resources available to deal with it and because the winds were not extremely strong. What I really am going to be looking for is an escalating level of overall fire activity, but the big catalyst for a really concerning fire weather event in California will still be the wind. So the fuels are ready and set to go in a way that is, quite frankly, very concerning, like they were in the fall of 2017. And folks in the North Bay in California remember what happened that October. Again, that is not a specific prediction. That was a particularly catastrophic outcome, and there's no immediate indication of a wind event anything close to that magnitude. But my point is, the preconditions are very similar, alarmingly so, in the sense that there was a wet winter along the central and southern California coast, actually 2 consecutive wet winters. We still have that very high and now completely dead and cured grass loading from those wet conditions. We then had, in many cases, a record hot summer, and now, even in places that didn't see that record hot summer along the immediate coast, are now experiencing record heat in October. That has, cooked the vegetation, and according to this recent fuels and fire behavior advisory, it once again is at or approaching record flammability. The energy release component being the technical quantity there, the ERC. It isn't the only quantity that matters, but it is a pretty good bulk indicator of risk, especially if you get a big wind event to drive fires under those conditions. And so right now what we don't have is the wind event, thankfully. And I don't immediately see one on the horizon, but they probably will happen this fall at some point, and given how little precipitation, virtually zero in most places, that are likely to occur over the next couple of weeks, I think that there will be a conversation down the line at some point about at least 1 or 2 episodes of truly extreme wildfire risk in coastal, especially in central and southern California, within 100 miles of the coast or so. And that is, of course, where most people in California live. So this isn't the end of the season by any means. And I'm hoping at least we can wait until after the hurricanes are done doing their thing in the southeast. There's no guarantee that's going to happen. There is often overlap between the end of hurricane season and the end of wildfire season. Sometimes there's even overlap between the peak of hurricane season and the peak of wildfire season, and that remains possible this year because the peak of wildfire season in some cases has been pretty delayed. Not that it's been an inactive season to begin with. In fact, it's actually been quite an active season already, but the activity is extending much later into autumn than it typically would. Again, it's not unusual to see continued major fire activity in the central and south coast regions of California into October, certainly, and even into November or December in some years. But it is not typical to be seeing this level of fire activity across the interior west, where usually by this point it's much cooler with rain or even snow on the ground by mid-October. So that is where the really anomalous activity is right now in terms of actual fires on the ground. But the problem is in California, the potential for very active fire conditions is much above average, even if we aren't currently realizing them. My concern is that it will only take one significant wind event for that latent potential to be realized. So, a bit of a tangent there, but take a look at some other comments. Some comments earlier that the drawing wasn't quite coming through. Not quite sure why. Oh, I know what happened there. Okay, my apologies that the drawing tool didn't come through. I don't think my discussion was too disrupted by that. But I already know what happened, so I'll make sure that doesn't happen next time. There's been some big time conspiracy theories circulating on the internet about the perceived lack of disaster response in Appalachia and the southeast after Helene, and the reality is twofold. One is that by all accounts, the federal response and the local responses have been extremely well coordinated, and this has actually been one of the few things that's been consistent in the messaging across the political spectrum, which is that even the governors of North Carolina and Tennessee and Georgia have all said that the federal coordination has actually been excellent in this case, and that there was a very rapid, responsive effort to get folks in on the ground as quickly as possible. So it's not accurate to say that aid is being withheld for any reason. It's not accurate to say that for some reason there's a strategic withholding of aid. But on the other hand, it is also true that there are still people in desperate need who have not had access to this aid, and it's not for lack of trying. I think what folks don't quite realize is just how extreme this disaster truly was. And there is a lesson there too about how, when things get bad enough, there is only so much that can be done in the moment. We don't maintain, hundreds of thousands of first responders that are on call 24/7 in any given location. They exist at that scale across the country, but it takes time for anyone outside of the immediate disaster zone to get there. It's not cheap or easy to get folks in. And even then, when there's a disaster that's this bad, where you not only have flooding, but you have mountainsides that have collapsed, you have entire interstates and highways that were not just flooded or washed out locally, but completely scoured from the valleys. There's no trace of them left in some sections. Same with the water infrastructure and the telecommunications infrastructure. There is a limit to how quickly first responders can respond, especially in some of the more remote areas, the remote mountain tops and the valleys of Southern Appalachia. These are fairly remote areas to begin with. It takes a few hours to drive in there, even if the roads are totally clear. So imagine what it's like when there's these homesteads and these subdivisions and settlements that are scattered throughout the mountains that no longer have road access, and in many cases don't even have telecommunications access to tell emergency response folks where they are and what they need. That is one of the realities. I mean, this is a case where all the usual advice of having 3 to 5 days of drinking water and food, there are even cases where that is not enough, and unfortunately this is turning into one of them. In the more remote spots in Southern Appalachia, it's been over a week and there are still some folks who have not made contact with responders. The way they're doing this is they're actually doing the National Guard, the military, along with local response and response from other states in the mutual aid that has arrived, are essentially going valley by valley and just trying to find landing zones on individual properties to check on people and deliver things like food and water and medication, because they don't really know in a lot of cases where people are or what they need. So they're just trying to do a thorough canvassing. And in a lot of cases, they're saying, this is your one opportunity to get out. We're not going to be back potentially for weeks. So if you're going to need anything in the next few weeks, if you're not completely self-sufficient, you're probably going to have to come out with us. And of course, that too is turning into a conspiracy theory laden situation, because it is fairly uncommon to have a Black Hawk or a Chinook land in your on your lawn in your remote valley in the Appalachians and say, come with us or forever hold your peace, essentially. That sounds like something pretty dramatic is happening, and indeed it is, but it isn't what some folks are claiming it is. I won't even go into what some folks are claiming that it is. It is just the reality that in a situation like this, that with a very large-scale extreme disaster, a large-scale catastrophe in a geographically complex area, that is the systematic approach. You're going to have these first responders on foot or by helicopter coming in, making a quick port of call, as they see opportunities in each property, and moving on to the next one, because, some folks still haven't had contact at all. So I think my broader point is that I'm not sure a lot of people realize the true scope of this still. It really is sort of unlike something we've seen in a long time. And it's not to say that there aren't other disasters that have killed more people. Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico in the U.S., probably the most deadly disaster we've seen in many, many years, followed by Hurricane Katrina, of course, in New Orleans back in 2005. The differences there, though, is Puerto Rico, although being isolated in a certain extent by virtue of it being a relatively small island, it is still a much smaller area in terms of the spatial extent of the extreme flooding and the dispersion of people. Sometimes it is easier to respond to disasters in many ways when it is concentrated in a single or in a cluster of highly populated corridors, because at least you know what you're dealing with and where you need to go, where you need to send those people, those personnel, those resources. This is the challenge in Western Appalachia, is there are a fair number of people with some substantial towns and smaller cities, but there's also a lot of people living way out in the boonies, if you will, and this is the challenge. So I think there's a mismatch of expectations, and there is a reality that sometimes in a true worst case scenario like this one was, there is only so much that can be done in the moment. There are literally thousands and thousands of people responding, and that isn't enough still. So there's this dueling reality again, that there are a lot of folks who still haven't gotten the help that they need, but it's not because of a bungled response. It's not because of withheld effort or aid. It is simply because it truly is that bad, and the realities on the ground truly are that complex. So this is why it is frustrating when there is a funding shortfall for the FEMA disaster fund, for example, because it means that although this very aggressive emergency response has been, by all accounts, very well coordinated, the long-term response, which over months and even years, is very much at risk for this and any subsequent disasters that occur, including the now likely imminent one on the west coast of Florida later this week. This would extend, by the way, to any major wildfire events that occur in populated areas in the coming weeks, which is very possible, or anything else that transpires in that window as well. So this is the challenge between that and the Forest Service wildland firefighters being let go for the season, and already being understaffed this year, by the way, due to lack of funding and the fact that, quite frankly, there have been a lot of folks quitting because of very low pay, poor benefits, and what is honestly a very dangerous job for low pay and low benefits. It's not even a full-time position, and that's, of course, the challenge. These are largely seasonal workers who are being let go during our climate change expanded fire season. So another agency that has not been able to shift with the times and with the Earth's increasing temperatures. So another slight tangent, but it's actually brought me to something that I really wanted to emphasize. More broadly, about the nature of disaster response, and that in many ways the U.S. has some of the most advanced and effective disaster response capacity in the world, and yet it is still, relative to what it probably should be for optimal efficacy and efficiency, underfunded, under-resourced, and often suffers from partisan infighting in a way that ideally would not happen for something like this. And the corollary too is that, you know, when you hear about the need to be prepared to be on your own for a while, obviously, it does depend somewhat on where you live. There is an argument to be made that if you're in the middle of a major city, that you're much less likely to be isolated for extended periods. Although then again, if there is a truly major disaster to befall a large populated area, say like San Francisco or LA Metro or something like that, the prototypical one might be a very large earthquake. The reverse problem starts to become an issue, which is that everyone knows exactly what is needed and where, but it's needed at such a large scale that it's difficult to provide it all at once. And so, of course, this is something that California prepares for and that other areas rehearse responses to. But the reality is, in a really severe disaster situation in one of these places, you could see similar problems even in major cities where large-scale lack of access to telecommunications or drinking water or electricity for an extended period. And of course, you can survive without internet for an indefinite period, and food is usually a little bit less of an immediate concern. But things like losing the water supply, that's a real risk in a major earthquake, and it is one of the greatest concerns, I think, in terms of the things that could affect the most people and would pose the most immediate crisis, even in a place like California during a major earthquake in a major urban area, or perhaps even during a major flood event. There, as we've seen in Helene, ironically, too much water then leads to loss of usable water for an indefinite period. And that too is a scenario that could play out in California. So I've talked about the context of arc storm already with that disaster, but I also think it's interesting and informative to think about, to reflect also upon what it means to be individually prepared and collectively prepared for disasters. And some folks have made this point. There are both formal and informal disaster response mechanisms. FEMA, of course, being part of the official response. There's also state, local, and regional government responses that are on the official side. But there's also the informal side, which is, neighbors helping neighbors and people who have access to some resources sharing them when they're scarce and before the official response arrives. And often that's the stopgap, is that once there's time and ability to scale up the official or the formal disaster response capabilities, that's usually the best way to go. But in those moments before that happens, sometimes those informal, more localized responses can be critically important too. So it's an interesting conversation we had there about community and urban-rural divides and all of that. But it's also just something as simple as this is why when they say have 3 to 5 days of food and water, this is why when events like this unfold, because there are some outlier events where even that won't be enough, but much of the time that is the kind of window that you might need for the formal response to kick in, and then you'll be in better shape. So it's in that period before that happens, which is longer for the worse, generally speaking, the larger scale and the more intense the disaster is. So probably a better conversation to have on a different day in more depth, but I do think that that's another lesson to be drawn from all of this. Comment that it's already 94 degrees in Berkeley, which is kind of incredible. Once again, it's about noon. Let's see here. Yeah, I mean, folks are commenting that what's remarkable about the heat this year in California is that it just keeps going, like the evil Energizer bunny of heat waves. And, the funny thing is this does depend a little bit on exactly where you are. If you're in Half Moon Bay or, the Mendocino coast or even the west side of LA, this is actually the first, or really the second period of major heat of the season. The first being not until early September, and now again in October. But if you're inland, even just 20 or 30 miles inland, July was like this record-shattering hot month. June was really hot. August had some hot moments, but overall it wasn't as warm. But then now we're right back to that point, and I think it's getting weirder and weirder and eerier as we, inch closer to Halloween to continue to have August-like or even July-like temperatures. So folks have called this October, the concatenation of course, August and October. And frankly, that's a pretty apt concatenation because we are literally seeing August-like temperatures, or even hotter in some cases, well into October, and that's likely to continue. Yeah, Dave Anthony mentions that this summer has had, well, irrespective of heat waves, from a surfing perspective, few oceanic waves. So really calm ocean. There's a few reasons for that. Sometimes in summer you'll get large swells from hurricanes off the west coast of Mexico. It's been kind of a relatively quiet year for that. Also, you can actually get large swells in Southern California sometimes from southern hemisphere storms. So that's sort of random whether or not we got that this year. But the other piece is too, the northwest flow along the coast of California has been kind of weak. So that coastal churn for the last couple of months has been on the weak side too. So there's less upwelling that leads to warm nearshore ocean temperatures, relatively speaking, but also that those smaller, higher, shorter period, higher frequency swells that you might get also aren't as present when you don't have those strong northwesterly winds either. So the long period, the really big swells, are generated mainly by distant storms in summer. But the higher frequency chop, I don't know how surfable that is all the time, but that also probably was more absent this year due to the lack of that flow. So it's an interesting observation. There's a comment that, or a question, I guess, that aren't maximum temperatures, the record levels, only taken relative to the past 150 years? Essentially, yes. We don't have thermometers in California from more than 150 years ago, so we don't have direct thermometer temperature record from prior to that point. So that's, of course, true, and that's true for much of the world. That's not just isolated to California. Even in the longest surface temperature record directly through thermometers, that only goes back a few hundred years, and that's mostly in places like Western Europe. So when we say record-breaking, yes, that usually does mean it has exceeded the data that is available, which is generally true of any characteristic of statistics, is that you can only really say how record-breaking it is relative to the data you've got. But the thing is, we do know the broader context, of course, of regional and Earth temperatures going back a lot more than 150 years, long before we had thermometers creating that record directly. That's known as the paleoclimate record, and going back at least hundreds to a couple thousand years, we can use tree ring records, so dendrochronology, to infer how warm it's been. From that kind of record, we don't know how hot it was on individual days, of course. Trees don't record that with that fine temporal granularity, but we can tell, in many cases, at the resolution of individual seasons, how hot and or dry it was. And then going back even farther, tens to hundreds of thousands of years, or even millions of years, we can look to other parts of the paleoclimate record, so the indirect proxy record of regional and Earth temperatures. And again, in that context, we see that the temperature changes that we're seeing, and certainly the carbon dioxide changes, which lead those temperatures that we're seeing, are unprecedented in, respectively, thousands of years and hundreds of thousands of years for temperature and CO2. So that's the big picture. Yes, there's a comment about what would it take to refund FEMA's disaster fund. Well, it would take an act of Congress, to my knowledge, and I'm not actually a disaster expert nor a policy expert by any means, but I do believe it would take an authorization by Congress. Congress is currently in recess, and not expected to come back until November after the presidential election. Pretty extended recess during peak disaster season, arguably. The argument was that FEMA had already received a new infusion of funding a few weeks back during the continuing resolution. This became a partisan issue. There was a vote along party lines, and essentially it was decided that FEMA did not need as much funding as had been requested because it was, quote, excessive. Clearly that was not factually true, either in the moment or especially in retrospect. So what would it take? Well, there has been a call to reconvene Congress from its break for what would effectively be an emergency session, but it's unclear whether that's going to happen. So it could be resolved. It's unclear that it will be resolved soon enough to avoid direct implications for disaster response through FEMA. I think that's probably all we can say right now. There was a presidential request to reconvene Congress, but generally speaking, that's not an order. That's a request, and so we'll see what happens. Yes, so there's a comment. Did I see the paper published in Nature this week about how excess mortality in the 15 years after a catastrophe, in this case it was specifically hurricanes, measure in the tens of thousands, even when the immediate count is usually under 100. This has been circulating, I think, in climate and weather science circles a lot in recent days. I'm not entirely sure what to make of it yet, except to say that it's very likely true that the true toll of most disasters in terms of death and health and morbidity and mortality, as well as economic losses, is almost always universally far higher than the actual direct toll suggests, because it's the indirect stuff, like the trauma and the stress. That's bad for your health. But imagine, your house is damaged, but it's not destroyed. Well, you still got to live in it. You still got to fix it. You might be living in a damaged, moldy environment. That's stressful. That's potentially bad for your health. And you might or might not get a payout from insurance or for FEMA if the disaster damage is somewhere, in that middle territory. It didn't destroy your house. It didn't make it completely unlivable, but it sure made it miserable. It might be making you sick. There are all sorts of biological and toxic hazards in the wake of hurricanes. Storm surges and freshwater flooding move stuff from chemical facilities, from wastewater treatment plants, from Superfund sites into your neighborhood and maybe even into your house. All that mud, all that sand, that's essentially low-level toxic waste in some cases, and it can be both microbiological contamination and chemical contamination, depending on the situation. Those effects are very difficult to quantify for individuals, because it's not like this is a thing that kills you tomorrow and therefore you're counted on that disaster scorecard, but it might be something that contributes to a chronic illness or cancer or an autoimmune disease or something that takes you out down the line. Or if it doesn't kill you, it might still make your life, again, it might make you sick, or it might reduce your capacity to earn income, or it might force you to spend thousands and thousands of dollars on medical treatment. So that is the kind of effect that this paper is trying to quantify, and it's impossible to pinpoint it for individuals, but a population level, which is what that research is doing, suggests that the losses are probably in the thousands for most disasters that occur, which is, I think, an important perspective to take when we talk about, there's some very misleading statistics out there about how disasters have or haven't changed over time and links to climate change that we're already over the hour, so I won't get into that today. But I think this is one reason why we often undercount the harms from events, and it'll be interesting to know whether the similar statistics are true of other disasters. This was specifically true of hurricanes, and there is some reason to believe that the risks with hurricanes might be larger and broader than with other events, because you're moving so much water. There is a direct contamination aspect to things that is not present during some other disasters. But again, similar scenarios in an earthquake or in a wildfire, there are dust and smoke emissions that can be both toxic, chemically speaking, and also, microbiologically. Valley fever, for example, is thought to be spread potentially by wildfire smoke in some cases. So there's all sorts of second and third and fourth order effects we often don't account for, and that's what this kind of work is accounting for. It is a Nature paper. It just came out. I'm not a public health expert. I'm not an economist. I'm not really equipped to quantitatively, reassess that. But generally speaking, I will say this, is that the particular authors who did it are usually quite methodical, and it's not ridiculous. It actually seems quite plausible from the perspective of someone who studies these things, at least in their physical form, that the net consequences of disasters like hurricanes, that are really like these multi-hazard kind of events, are probably far greater than are captured in the formal statistics that describe the harm and the losses associated with them in the immediate aftermath. That's very likely to be true, so it's just a question of whether the numbers here generalize or not. There's a comment that in the neighbor's avocado orchard, the trees are brown and crispy on the top third. The past 15 years, haven't seen this. That's not a great sign. Hopefully those avocado trees survive, as an avocado aficionado. Ugtober, UGH-tober, that's another good one. Ogtober, Ugtober, they both work. Probably a lot of iced pumpkin spice lattes this year showing up in California. All right, well, there's some off-topic comments showing up in the comment stream, so perhaps that's a sign. This has been another fairly long office hour. I'm once again very impressed by the number of folks who have stuck around for the full hour and 15 minutes. Thanks again for joining. Again, this channel is sponsored by Reask, a company, a climate tech company that is helping essentially quantify the kinds of events we're talking about today, extreme flood, hurricane risk in a warming world, and how to better manage those risks. So thank you for that support. And also, if you are interested in supporting the channel, you can do so simply by liking these videos or subscribing. I suspect many of you were probably notified that I was doing a short notice live stream today because you were subscribed. I do post that on social media, but honestly the most reliable way to get that information, especially for these short notice sessions, is to be subscribed. So I strongly suggest and would appreciate if you did so, if you're so inclined. I'll be, but as I mentioned earlier, I will be traveling this week, so it's going to be harder for me to do live sessions as things unfold. I will be available. Again, you can find me now on most of the big social media platforms. I still am on Twitter/X, whatever it's called this week. Although I have really ramped up on Blue Sky, which is now open to the public and increasingly an appealing option. So you can find me there, as well as on Threads and Mastodon, and here on YouTube, as well as the Weather West blog, as many of you are already readers over on weatherwest.com. So I do try to make it easy to follow. And although I might not have a YouTube session again in the next few days due to travel, I will be on social media, and you can definitely follow updates there as everything unfolds as described today. So thanks for joining, and have a good weekend. Stay cool. Don't start any wildfires that are unwanted, and talk to you next time.